None of us like paying income tax. And according to Howard Lutnick, who's the U.S. Commerce Secretary, we may have an opportunity to see what it's like to not pay income tax in the very near future. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you what Howard Lutnick said, why it matters, and what it means to you and I. So let's start off listening to what Howard Lutnick said in this interview with CBS News.
How about no tax on tips? How about no tax on overtime? How about no Social Security? How about all those things? These are the kind of thoughts that will change America. I know what his goal is. No tax for anybody who makes less than $150,000 a year.
Okay, so that's what the U.S. Commerce Secretary said. Now, why does it matter to us? For that, I want to go to an article on Newsweek, and it's called No Taxes If You Earn Less Than $150K, Donald Trump's Plan Explained. And the first section I want to go through is why it matters. It matters because according to Newsweek, and this vibes with my experience as well, in 2022, almost 95%, 93% of all Americans age 15 and over earned less than $150,000, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So what does Newsweek say that we need to know? Lutnick said that the federal government would counteract massive U.S. tax cuts by implementing tariffs on foreign nations and curbing overseas tax evasion. So we know about the tariffs, that's been in the news a lot, but what does Howard Lutnick mean when he says curbing overseas tax evasion? This article by Newsweek shares with us that Lutnick noted that many commercial ships sail under flags of other nations such as Liberia to avoid U.S. taxation. The quote is, "All those ships are paying no tax. It's a tax scam," he said. He goes on to say that many U.S. companies hold their intellectual property in Ireland because of its favorable tax regime. Ireland has a $60 billion surplus because our companies drop their IP there. They pay Ireland the money. Tax scam, he said. How about we end tax scams? And then commenting on Trump's tax proposal, Lutnick said, the rest of the world leans on our economy, breathes off of our economy. Not only is our economy 29 trillion, but we consume 20 trillion a year. We are the buyer of everybody else's stuff. So essentially what the Trump administration is doing is moving the U.S. or would like to move the U.S. from an income tax to a sales tax, essentially, because when you look at the tariffs, that's cost, as we're all seeing, is going to, at least to some extent, be passed on to U.S. consumers. So that's a consumption tax. When we buy stuff, we pay additional money off of that. So what Trump is saying and Lutnick is explaining is Donald Trump would like the middle class not to pay income tax and instead get additional revenue from those tariffs, which you and I are going to pay a part of, and then from cutting down tax loopholes like Lutnick was talking about with these worldwide shipping boats that that are registered in different countries, although they're basically coming back and forth to the United States. And then also looking at, are there tax loopholes that are basically allowing U.S. companies to legally move some of their profits overseas, or maybe a lot of their profits overseas, and then pay a lower tax rate in Ireland instead of the United States. I know Trump has also talked about lowering the corporate income tax so that there's less of an incentive for companies to go to places like Ireland. And frankly, what I think the world needs to do is set up like a minimum corporate tax. So it's not a race to the bottom. It's not, right now, Ireland is one of the low tax locations that a corporation can put. What some of its value add is, you can base that in Ireland and then legally say, well, the company that holds the IP, like for the patents for the iPhone and stuff like that, if that IP is owned by a company that's based in Ireland, then some of the iPhone sales, and I hate to target Apple on this, or just one example, but if some of that sales is a license for using that IP, that's how companies get their profits outside of the United States and pay a low tax rate. But if all the countries in the world said, or developed country, places where it's attractive to base your company headquarters, if all of the countries in developed countries said, you know what, there is a there's a floor. You cannot go below, let's say, 15%. I mentioned that because Donald Trump has talked about a 15% corporate tax rate. And so I think a lot of Americans, middle-class Americans, folks that are making less than $150,000 a year, look at this and say, this might be an experiment worth trying. You know, the goal is, does it work? And the challenge is, if we look at how much that we buy, could we move it to a consumption tax? There's some smart people that say no, it would not raise enough capital to offset what we would lose from an income tax. There's other smart people that have looked at this and say, yes, it would work. So is this an experiment that we're going to try? And if we do try it, you know, what does it mean to middle-class America? Well, what it means is, if we're consuming a lot of goods and services, if we're not saving anything, then in some ways the middle class might be hurt more, because people that make, let's just say, you know, $5 million a year, how much more are they really consuming than middle-class Americans? They're consuming a lot more, but they're probably going to be the ones that win. Now, I know a lot of us are saying, let's try this experiment. You know, I think it's worthwhile to look at the math and say, would this work? Because we don't want the deficit to explode. But if it does work, there's a lot of folks that would say, you know, let's give this a try. But realize some people over a 12-month period might actually be much better off with an income tax than a consumption tax. One of the things a lot of countries outside of the US do is they have what's called the value-added tax, and that can raise a ton of money for a country very quickly. But it's also, once you have a value-added tax, which essentially says, you know, at every step in the process, as value is created, that gets taxed. And so it raises a lot of capital very quickly, but it can become a very big tax. And I think there is a chance, and I don't know, we have to try this, but there is a chance that people making less than $150,000 a year would look back and say, you know what, I was better off under the old system. I can tell you, people making $1 million, $5 million a year, they're probably much better off under this system than under an income tax, because they were getting taxed on all of their income, but they weren't consuming all of what they earned. So, you know, I think wealthy people are very willing to give this a try. What I don't know is, should we in the middle class, is this something that we should support? In general, an income tax seems to be, on the surface, fairer to mean for all citizens. The challenge, of course, is wealthy people have very smart accountants that figure out loopholes, that have figured out how to minimize their income tax. So, you know, even though the published rate says, okay, the top rate is 37% and your income goes to taxes, very few wealthy people are actually paying that. If you like this video, the YouTube algorithm says this is the next video of mine you should watch. Thanks for watching this one. I'll say bye.